When authorities intervene in a financial system, it is usually presented as reassurance, a sign that the situation is under control, a signal meant to calm markets, stabilize confidence, and restore order. But history shows something very different. Interventions do not arrive at the beginning of crises. They arrive after the system has already begun to fracture, when normal mechanisms stop working and trust quietly erodes beneath the surface. In every major banking disruption, the pattern is remarkably consistent. At first, officials insist there is no problem. Then they acknowledge stress in isolated areas. Finally, they intervene, not loudly, but carefully, with language designed to sound routine. What changes from one crisis to the next is not the response itself, but how quickly confidence evaporates once intervention becomes visible. Modern financial systems are built on the assumption that liquidity will always be available, that deposits will move freely, that short-term funding markets will function without interruption, and most importantly, that institutions trust each other enough to keep lending overnight, every single day. When that trust weakens, the system does not collapse instantly. It slows, it tightens, and then it freezes in places most people never see. The first stage of intervention rarely looks dramatic. There are no emergency speeches, no televised addresses. Instead, there are policy statements filled with technical language, adjustments to standing facilities, temporary expansions of liquidity programs, carefully worded assurances that everything is well capitalized and orderly. To the public, these moves appear boring, but to markets, they are loud signals that something has already gone wrong. When authorities step in, it is not to prevent panic among ordinary depositors. It is to stop sophisticated actors from acting on information faster than everyone else. Large institutions, hedge funds, corporate treasuries, and high-net-worth clients do not wait for headlines. They respond to signals embedded in balance sheets, funding spreads, and regulatory behavior. By the time intervention is announced, money has often already begun to move. This is why modern interventions are designed to be quiet. Loud rescues confirm fear. Silent ones attempt to mask it. The goal is no longer to restore confidence broadly, but to buy time. Time for banks to manage outflows. Time for regulators to assess exposure. Time for markets to convince themselves that the damage is contained. But containment is a fragile illusion in a system built on daily trust. In recent years, authorities have relied heavily on liquidity facilities rather than direct bailouts. This distinction matters. Bailouts are visible and politically costly. Liquidity facilities are technical, temporary, and easier to justify. They allow banks to borrow against assets that markets no longer value at full price. In theory, this prevents forced selling. In practice, it reveals which institutions cannot survive without official support. Once liquidity facilities expand, markets begin to read between the lines. Which assets are being accepted? At what valuation? For how long? Each adjustment sends a message, not of strength, but of tolerance. How much weakness the system is willing to absorb before admitting something is broken. Interventions also change behavior in subtle ways. Banks that access emergency facilities signal vulnerability, even if participation is anonymous. Counterparties grow cautious. Credit committees tighten standards. Overnight, lending becomes selective. The system continues functioning, but at a slower, more defensive pace. What was once automatic now requires justification. This is where the psychology of intervention becomes critical. Confidence is not restored by action alone. It is restored when participants believe action will not be needed again. Repeated intervention sends the opposite signal. It suggests that the system cannot stand on its own. History offers clear examples. In 2008, the failure of Lehman Brothers shattered the assumption that authorities would always step in. The intervention that followed was massive, explicit, and unavoidable. In 2020, markets froze, not because banks were insolvent, but because no one trusted prices in a moment of global uncertainty. Intervention came fast and overwhelmingly large. Confidence returned, but dependence increased. In 2023, the pattern shifted again. The problem was not broad panic, it was targeted doubt. Depositors questioned specific institutions, specific business models, specific asset exposures. Intervention became more surgical. Facilities were Tailored language became more careful, but the underlying issue remained the same. Trust was no longer evenly distributed. Each intervention narrowed the circle of perceived safety. Deposits concentrated in fewer institutions. Risk migrated rather than disappeared. The system stabilized, but at the cost of fragility elsewhere. By the time authorities intervene, the run is rarely visible on the surface. There are no crowds at branches, no viral images. Instead, there are spreadsheets showing deposit flows, internal dashboards tracking liquidity positions, quiet calls between executives and regulators. The run unfolds digitally, rationally, and efficiently. Intervention attempts to interrupt this process by restoring confidence in funding markets, but funding markets are not emotional. They respond to incentives. If institutions believe future support will be available, they may continue operating as usual. If they believe support will become politically constrained or conditional, they reduce exposure preemptively. This is the paradox of intervention. It must be credible enough to stop fear, but limited enough to avoid encouraging recklessness. Too little support accelerates collapse. Too much support erodes discipline. Navigating that balance becomes harder as the system grows more complex. As interventions multiply, another problem emerges. Normal pricing mechanisms break down. Assets held at par no longer trade at par. Liquidity replaces valuation as the dominant concern. Institutions stop asking what something is worth and start asking whether it can be converted into cash tomorrow. Once this mindset takes hold, the system changes character. It becomes less about growth and more about survival. Lending slows. Risk appetite shrinks. Capital becomes defensive. The economy above the financial system begins to feel the effects. Even if no formal crisis has been declared, authorities are acutely aware of this risk. That is why intervention is often framed as temporary, precautionary, and technical. The goal is to prevent behavior from changing too much. But behavior always changes. Once participants see the scaffolding, they understand the building is under stress. This is why interventions rarely end runs completely. They pause them, they redirect them, they shift pressure from one area to another. Confidence does not return uniformly. It fragments in T's pays. Markets begin to distinguish between institutions that can survive without support and those that cannot. Depositors do the same. Money flows toward perceived safety, even if that safety is theoretical. Smaller institutions feel the strain first. Larger ones absorb inflows, but also inherit systemic risk. Intervention creates winners and losers. Even when it claims neutrality, it reshapes the financial landscape quietly, without legislation, without votes, without public debate. And once this process begins, it is difficult to reverse. Trust, once conditional, rarely becomes unconditional again. Every future shock is measured against past interventions. Every reassurance is discounted by memory. This is the moment where the system appears calm, but is internally unstable, where liquidity exists, but only because it is being supplied artificially, where confidence persists, but only within narrowing boundaries. The intervention phase is not the end of a crisis. It is the middle, the point where collapse is avoided, but resolution has not yet begun. The point where the system continues to function, but no longer freely. And as long as interventions remain necessary, the underlying question remains unanswered. Not whether authorities can stop the run today, but whether they can convince the system that a run will not be needed tomorrow. That question lingers quietly beneath every policy statement, every facility expansion, every assurance that the system is sound. Because once trust requires intervention to survive, it is no longer trust at all. Intervention changes the structure of the system long before it changes the outcome. Once authorities become an active participant rather than a distant backstop, every decision inside the financial system begins to reference that presence. Banks adjust strategy not around markets, but around policy expectations. Depositors adjust behavior not around guarantees, but around credibility. And markets begin to price not fundamentals, but political and institutional limits. This is where intervention stops being a response and becomes a condition. In T-space, liquidity is no longer scarce in absolute terms. Central banks can create reserves, facilities can expand, Balance sheets can grow. The issue is not whether money exists, but where it is allowed to move. Liquidity becomes uneven, concentrated, conditional. It flows where confidence aligns with policy support and retreats everywhere else. That retreat is quiet. It doesn't trigger alarms. It shows up as reduced lending activity, delayed projects, postponed investment. Banks become selective, not because they are insolvent, but because uncertainty changes incentives. When survival matters more than growth, caution dominates. Authorities attempt to counter this by signaling commitment. Forward guidance becomes more explicit. Language becomes more reassuring, but reassurance loses power when it has to be repeated. The more often stability is emphasized, the more markets infer instability beneath the surface. This is the credibility gap that interventions struggle to close. In theory, emergency measures are designed to bridge short-term disruptions. In reality, they often become semi-permanent features of the system. Temporary facilities are extended. Eligibility is broadened. Valuation standards are adjusted. Each step makes sense. In isolation, together, they redefine normality. Once that happens, markets recalibrate. Participants stop asking whether intervention will occur and start asking how much and for how long. Risk pricing adapts accordingly. Leverage returns, but in different forms. Exposure shifts to areas perceived as implicitly protected. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more the system relies on intervention, the more disruptive the absence of intervention would be. Authorities become trapped by their own success. Having prevented collapse, they must now prevent adjustment. But adjustment is unavoidable. Interventions delay consequences. They do not eliminate them. Losses that are not recognized accumulate elsewhere. Balance sheets carry assets valued by policy rather than market demand. Confidence rests on assumptions about future support rather than current strength. This fragility remains invisible as long as conditions remain calm, but it becomes acute when stress reappears. A tat-point intervention faces diminishing returns. The first announcement reassures. The second, the third, raises questions. By default, markets begin to doubt whether tools are still effective or simply exhausted. This is when trust fractures along new lines, not between banks and depositors, but between markets and authorities. Depositors begin to question not whether their money is insured, but whether access will remain frictionless, whether transfers will slow, whether limits will appear, whether rules will change overnight. These questions don't require panic to matter. They only require doubt. Sophisticated actors move first. They diversify liquidity across institutions. They shorten maturities. They prioritize optionality. Each move is rational. Collectively, they strain the system. Authorities respond by reinforcing barriers. Stress tests are adjusted. Supervision tightens. Messaging emphasizes resilience. But resilience framed as regulation rather than strength often signals weakness. This is the stage where the system becomes stable in appearance, but brittle in structure. It can withstand small shocks, but struggles with unexpected ones. It is optimized for the last crisis, not the next. Intervention also reshapes public perception. Bailouts once triggered outrage. Liquidity facilities now trigger indifference. The technical complexity obscures accountability. The public senses that something is wrong, but cannot identify where or why. That disconnect erodes institutional trust over time, not suddenly, but steadily. Confidence becomes conditional on continued support. Faith in markets is replaced by faith in policymakers, and faith in policymakers is finite. Every intervention consumes credibility. Even successful ones. Each time authorities assert control, they narrow the margin for error in the future. Eventually, markets test those limits. This is why the intervention phase is not resolution. It is postponement, a holding pattern that depends on stable conditions. As long as nothing unexpected happens, the system holds. But economies do not remain static. Rates change, growth slows, defaults rise. Political pressures intervene. External shocks arrive. When they do, the question is no longer whether intervention can occur, but whether it will be believed. If confidence in intervention weakens, the system faces a new kind of run, not a run on banks, but a run on assumptions on guarantee, on the idea that stability is automatic. Attack point interventions lose their calming effect. They begin to accelerate exits rather than slow them. Each new measure confirms fear rather than dispels it. This is the moment authorities try hardest to avoid, the moment when policy tools still exist, but trust in those tools does not. The system then enters a different phase entirely, one where intervention is no longer a solution, but part of the problem. That phase is not marked by collapse. It is marked by stagnation, by frozen capital, by economic drag, by a sense that the system works, but only barely. Growth becomes harder, credit becomes scarcer, risk-taking disappears, innovation slows, the financial system survives, but the economy above it weakens. This is how crises extend beyond banks, not through dramatic failures, but through prolonged constraint. Intervention succeeds in preventing immediate disaster, but fails to restore dynamism. The system becomes safer, but less productive, more controlled, but less adaptive, and over time, that trade-off becomes visible. Public trust erodes not because of collapse, but because opportunity disappears. Because because outcomes worsen while assurances remain optimistic. This is the true cost of prolonged intervention. Not inflation, not debt, but the gradual loss of belief that the system rewards participation fairly. When that belief fades, no amount of liquidity can restore it. Intervention can stabilize balance sheets. It cannot manufacture confidence indefinitely. At some point, the system must prove it can function without constant support. Or it must accept permanent dependency. That decision is rarely explicit. It emerges through inertia, through extensions, through quiet normalization of emergency measures. And by the time it is recognized, reversal is difficult. This is why the intervention phase is the most deceptive stage of a financial crisis. It looks like control. It feels like stability. It produces calm. But beneath that calm, the system is fundamentally changed. The run has not ended. It has evolved. Money still moves. Trust still shifts. Risk still concentrates. It just does so under the surface, guided not by panic, but by calculation. And as long as calculation favors exit over engagement, intervention will only slow the process, not stop it. The real question is not whether authorities can intervene again. It is whether the system can ever function normally once intervention becomes the rule, rather than the exception. Because when stability depends on constant support, the next shock does not need to be large. It only needs to arrive.